Okay, so as we talked about before, we have the alveoli. This is what the image I was looking for. So this has this is the alveoli space. So this is, as we remember, we inhale and it goes down our bronchial tubes, and the primary, secondary, tertiary, and then into those little sacs of alveoli. And so we have the oxygen here in the air, and then we have you can see how small these cells are. It's only a single cell thick. And then this is the blood vessel, because if you remember, those alveoli have blood vessels that are enwrapped around it. And so the oxygen is easy to diffuse right across into the blood, and then it attaches into the red blood cell on a protein called hemoglobin. So red blood cells, if you remember, have almost no organelles. They don't have nuclei, and they don't have a lot of other organelles. So they're really big sacs of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a really cool protein that people study years. They spend their lives studying hemoglobin. And if you ever take biochemistry, they talk about it all the time. But it's a really interesting protein that has four polypeptides. So it has quaternary structure. And so as one oxygen binds, that actually causes a change in the protein that make it easier for other oxygen molecules to bind. So that's called cooperative binding. So as one oxygen binds, then it's easier for the other three to bind. So one hemoglobin molecule will bind four oxygen. And so then that carries the oxygen to the cell. And then as it gets to the cell, it's going to release that oxygen. And it releases it, so it really holds tightly. But then there are things that kind of change the hemoglobin, or just kind of shift it a little bit to help it, hemoglobin, release the oxygen. So, and those things are carbon dioxide, temperature, something called BPG, which is a byproduct of ATP. So all of those help kind of change the hemoglobin a little bit so that it's more likely to release oxygen. So as you get closer to the cells, the pH will change, and the presence of the BPG will change, and so then you release oxygen at the cells. So it's pretty cool. It's really a nice system. And so it's also cooperatively released. So once one oxygen is released, the other three are easily released as well. Okay, and then it circles back to the lungs again and picks up more oxygen. Okay, so that's how oxygen is transported in the blood. So now we have to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So again, the carbon dioxide is a byproduct of how we get energy from glucose. So as CO2 builds up in the cells, it's released, and then it's picked up in the blood. And it's about 93%, 7% are dissolved as CO2, 93% go into the red blood cell. About 23% bind to hemoglobin, so a little bit binds to hemoglobin. But 70% is converted to CH2CO3 by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. So most of it is carried as this compound. So this is really good because, as CO3 can dissociate into H plus and HCO3 minus, and that is good. That'll help the CO2 get out of the red blood cell and released into the lungs. So the control of respiration is located in our brainstem region and pons. So the pons has the pneumotaxic center. So you can actually control some of your breathing. So if you are a little anxious, you might notice that you breathe a little more, or you're upset. So you might notice that you're breathing a little bit more. Or if you're relaxed, you notice that you'll a little more easier breathing. And sometimes if you're upset, if you notice that if you just take a few deep breaths, that will help calm you down. So it's controlled. It has some control from the higher centers, but you can't totally control your breathing because this part of the brain doesn't have, you can't control this part of the brain. And if you have an injury in this part of the brain too, it can be quite devastating. So it could be, lethal. So which is too bad. So so your breathing rate is also dependent on how much CO2 is in the blood. So if you start exercising, you'll notice that you'll start to breathe a little bit more. And that's because you have chemoreceptors that can sense both oxygen levels and CO2 levels. And if it gets out of balance, it's going to signal to your brain to start breathing a little bit more so you can get rid of that CO2. So when you're exercising, you're using up more energy, so you're making more CO2. So you need to get rid of the CO2, and you need more oxygen to make ATP. So you have chemoreceptors in different parts of your body, and baroreceptors in the carotids and other places. Okay, so that can also play a role in how well you breathe, how much you breathe. And it's also very rhythmic. So you inhale and exhale at a certain rhythm, and that's controlled by different nuclei in the brain as well. Okay, so it's really pretty fascinating. So it's something we often don't think about until we have a problem. My mother has COPD, and she would be healthy otherwise, but when she was younger, they thought it was super cool to smoke. Yeah, some people probably think that now, but but back then they probably knew that it wasn't good for you, but they didn't tell anybody. So all the movie stars were smoking, so everybody thought it was glamorous to smoke. And so she smoked since she was a teenager, and now she's 80, and now her lungs are really really horrible. So it's hard for her to breathe, and now she has oxygen, and it's a struggle. So if you don't really realize how important breathing is until you can't. So she's on oxygen, and you could always hear her breathing. So it's a real struggle. So it's really important to take care of your lungs. Obviously, don't smoke, but be careful about pollution. So in our air, we can we breathe in anything, even from harsh chemicals that we use for cleaning, or if we live in an industrial area, all of that can damage our lungs. So it's good to make sure that your lungs are good. So in our discussion this week, we'll be talking about air pollution and how that can affect our body. Okay, so we'll go to what we can do this week. Okay. Didn't know it was on. Okay, so for this week, read 22 in chapter 22 in Martini, or chapter 23 in Martini, or 22 in OpenStax, and review the PowerPoints and lecture. Complete the lab on the pulmonary respiration in the mastering part, and complete my lab, and complete the mastering assignment 11. And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about environmental toxins, which is pretty interesting. So we often think of it as being just, these big industrial, companies, but its toxins are everywhere, from what we use to clean with to what we use on our vegetables, work environment. So depending on what type of work you do, I was a research scientist, and we were exposed to lots of stuff that's horrible. And I remember being young and working with formaldehyde, which is what they use to preserve dead bodies with. And so I was preserving tissues, and we didn't have any ventilation back then. Now you have to have gloves and be in a fume hood so that everything is vented out. But when I was young, we just huffed it. So I know I probably have been exposed to a lot of really hazardous chemicals. So it's good to really know what's in your environment. And farmers too, you think farm is, out natural and, safe, but some of them, if you use pesticides or insecticides or anything like that, that is also an exposure environmental hazard. So Yeah, so think about the environmental hazards in your life, and then choose one and share it with your classmates. So it's always interesting. Okay, let me know if you have any questions, and continue to work on your presentation too. And let me know too if you have questions, if you don't have any idea what to do, or if you're stuck. We also have the embedded librarian, and that's a great resource. So if you want some great information about where to find resources, please use our embedded librarian, because they're always very helpful. Okay, great. Yeah, it should be a fun week. Yeah, yay.